February 19, 1943. The Atlas Mountains of western Tunisia are silent in the hour before dawn. The cold clings to the valleys, settling into the folds of khaki uniforms and steel helmets. Along a narrow mountain road, burned-out American trucks lie frozen where they were abandoned, their twisted frames still smoking faintly in the morning air. Above them, the Kasserine Pass opens like a wound in the mountains. German armor moves with practiced certainty. Panzer columns advance through the gap, engines low, crews alert, their silhouettes barely visible against the pale stone slopes. For the men of the U.S. Second Corps, many of them new to combat, the past 48 hours have been a lesson delivered with brutal clarity. Artillery positions have been overrun, units scattered, communications collapsed under pressure. From his headquarters miles away, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel studies the reports. He has faced British veterans, desert-hardened and cautious. This enemy feels different, unseasoned, disorganized, predictable. To Rommel, Kasserine confirms a belief forming since the Americans landed in North Africa, that the United States Army, for all its industry and ambition, does not yet know how to fight a modern war. But the smoke rising from Kasserine Pass is not the end of the story. It is the moment that forces an army to confront itself and decide what it will become. By early 1943, the Second World War had entered a dangerous middle phase. The Axis powers were no longer advancing everywhere, but they were far from defeated. In the East, German forces were still locked in a colossal struggle with the Soviet Union, reeling from the catastrophe at Stalingrad, yet retaining formidable combat power. In the West, Britain stood firm but exhausted, its army stretched thin after years of fighting across multiple theaters. The United States had been at war for just over a year. After Pearl Harbor, American industry surged into motion with unmatched speed. Shipyards expanded, aircraft factories ran day and night. Entire divisions were raised, trained, and shipped overseas in months. What the United States possessed in abundance was material strength and manpower. What it lacked, dangerously, was experience under fire. North Africa became the testing ground. Operation Torch, launched in November 1942, was the first large-scale American ground commitment against German forces. The landings in Morocco and Algeria brought U.S. troops face-to-face with a complex battlefield shaped by desert terrain, fragile logistics, and an enemy who had already spent years refining the art of mobile warfare. The strategic goal was clear. By securing North Africa, the Allies would eliminate Axis control of the southern Mediterranean, relieve pressure on British forces in Egypt, and open the door to an eventual invasion of southern Europe. It was also, for American commanders, an opportunity to blood a new army without immediately committing to a cross-channel invasion that few believed the U.S. was ready to execute. The early weeks appeared encouraging. Vichy French resistance collapsed faster than expected. Ports were secured. Supply lines were established. American units moved eastward, linking up with British forces advancing from Libya after their victory at El Alamein. But beneath the surface, cracks were already visible. American divisions arriving in Tunisia were trained according to pre-war doctrine that emphasized rigid command structures and centralized control. Orders flowed downward slowly. Initiative at lower levels was discouraged. Communications relied heavily on fixed positions and vulnerable lines. In peacetime exercises, these systems functioned. Under fire, they faltered. The terrain of Tunisia offered little forgiveness. The Atlas Mountains cut the country into natural corridors, forcing armies to funnel through narrow passes and valleys. Control of these gaps determined movement, supply, and survival. German commanders understood this intimately. For the Americans, it was an unfamiliar and hostile environment. The enemy waiting for them was not an abstract threat. The German Afrika Korps, along with Italian units and newly arrived reinforcements, represented some of the most experienced troops in the Wehrmacht. These were formations hardened by years of desert warfare. Their officers were skilled at maneuver, deception, and rapid exploitation of weakness. Their tanks, particularly the Panzer III and IV variants then in service, were well coordinated with infantry and artillery. At the center of this force was Erwin Rommel. Rommel's reputation had been forged in France in 1940 and sharpened in North Africa. He was aggressive, intuitive, and willing to take calculated risks. Though stretched thin by supply shortages and increasing Allied air power, Rommel remained dangerous. He understood that his time in Africa was limited. Every blow had to count. American intelligence underestimated this reality. Reports from the field suggested that German forces were retreating, that they were low on fuel, that their ability to launch large-scale attacks was diminishing. These assessments were not entirely false, but they were incomplete. Rommel did not need overwhelming strength, he needed opportunity. That opportunity emerged in the winter of 1943, when American units were spread across a wide front in central Tunisia. The Second Corps, under Major General Lloyd Fredendall, occupied a series of isolated positions with limited mutual support. Units were positioned according to map logic rather than battlefield reality. Rommel saw what the Americans did not. He saw an enemy still learning how to coordinate armor, infantry, and air power. He saw command posts far removed from the front. He saw defensive lines that could be penetrated and then rolled up from behind. And he recognized that a sharp, focused blow could do more than win ground. It could shatter confidence. As winter tightened its grip on the Atlas Mountains, both sides prepared for what they believed would be the next phase of the campaign. For the Americans, it was an exercise in consolidation. For Rommel, it was an opportunity to strike before the Allies could fully organize. The collision that followed would take place at a mountain pass few outside Tunisia had ever heard of, but one that would soon become synonymous with hard lessons learned under fire. By February 1943, the Axis position in North Africa was precarious but not yet broken. German and Italian forces were compressed into a narrowing pocket in Tunisia, caught between British armies advancing from the east and Allied forces pushing in from the west. Supplies flowed through a shrinking network of ports under constant Allied air attack. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles were increasingly scarce. Yet scarcity did not equate to weakness. The Axis command structure in Tunisia was complex, but its frontline units remained lethal. Rommel's Panzer Army Africa, reinforced by elements of the 5th Panzer Army under General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, retained the ability to concentrate armor rapidly. German doctrine emphasized flexibility, rapid decision-making, and coordinated combined arms assaults. Even in retreat, these forces could turn and strike with devastating effect. Rommel's strategic thinking in early 1943 was shaped by urgency. He understood that Tunisia was likely the final chapter of the African campaign. Rather than waiting to be ground down by Allied superiority in men and machines, he sought to disrupt Allied plans, inflict psychological damage, and buy time. A decisive blow against inexperienced American forces could destabilize the entire Allied front. The opportunity lay in central Tunisia. The American Second Corps occupied a broad sector stretching across the western approaches to the Atlas Mountains. Its units were dispersed across ridgelines and valleys, often beyond effective supporting distance of one another. The assumption was that holding ground mattered more than controlling movement. In practice, this meant thin defenses and exposed flanks. Command decisions amplified these vulnerabilities. Major General Lloyd Fredendall directed operations from a heavily fortified headquarters located deep in the rear, more than 70 miles from some front-line positions. Orders were often issued through layers of intermediaries, diluting clarity and slowing response times. Subordinate commanders had limited freedom to adapt to rapidly changing conditions on the ground. When German reconnaissance probed American positions in January and early February, the warning signs were missed or misunderstood. Small clashes revealed gaps in coordination between U.S. armor and infantry. Artillery was often positioned without adequate observation. Air support, though available in theory, was poorly integrated with ground operations. The Germans took note. Rommel planned a concentrated attack through the Fide and Kasserine passes, aiming to rupture American defenses and exploit the interior lines of the Atlas Mountains. His forces included experienced panzer units, mechanized infantry, and artillery capable of rapid redeployment. Though outnumbered overall, he intended to achieve local superiority at decisive points. The attack began. In mid-February, at the Fide Pass, German armor punched through American positions with alarming speed. U.S. units, unfamiliar with German tactics and overwhelmed by the tempo of the assault, fell back in disorder. Attempts to counterattack were fragmented and poorly coordinated. Communications broke down as units lost contact with higher headquarters and neighboring formations. Kasserine Pass soon became the focal point. The pass was a narrow, winding corridor through the mountains, an ideal avenue for armored exploitation and a nightmare for unprepared defenders. American units attempted to form defensive lines, but they were pieced together from elements of different divisions with little shared experience. Leadership at the point of contact was inconsistent. Some units fought hard, others were caught off guard, forced to withdraw under intense pressure. Rommel pressed forward. German tanks advanced methodically, supported by artillery and infantry working in close coordination. When resistance stiffened, German units maneuvered around it. When American positions collapsed, they exploited the gap without hesitation. The battlefield became a series of disconnected fights rather than a coherent defense. Within days, the situation deteriorated. American casualties mounted. Equipment was abandoned in haste. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. For many U.S. soldiers, this was their first experience of sustained combat against a skilled enemy. The confidence built during training evaporated under fire. From Rommel's perspective, the conclusion seemed obvious. The Americans, he believed, were brave but untrained, well-equipped but poorly led, dependent on rigid plans and slow decision-making. In his post-action assessments, he would later describe them as inexperienced and vulnerable to rapid maneuver. Yet, even as German forces surged through Kasserine Pass, the limitations of Rommel's success were already emerging. Supplies remained critically short. Allied air power was beginning to assert itself, and crucially, the shock of defeat was triggering a response within the American command structure. The pass had been breached, the lines had bent and broken, but the campaign itself was far from over. What followed would determine whether Kasserine Pass was a defining failure or the catalyst for transformation. The first and most immediate angle of Kasserine Pass was human. For the American soldiers who fought there, the battle stripped away any remaining illusions about war. Many had arrived in North Africa expecting hardship, but not chaos. Training had taught them how to advance, how to occupy positions, how to follow orders. It had not prepared them for the disorienting violence of modern mechanized combat. Units were thrown together from different divisions, often meeting for the first time under fire. Officers struggled to locate their men amid smoke, dust, and the roar of engines. Messages arrived late or not at all. Rumors traveled faster than facts. In some positions, soldiers held their ground for hours, firing until ammunition ran low. In others, confusion spread, and withdrawal turned into flight. Fear was not the absence of courage, it was the presence of uncertainty. Many American soldiers would later describe Kasserine as the moment they realized survival depended not just on bravery, but on coordination, on knowing where friendly units were, when support would arrive, and who was in charge. The battlefield punished hesitation and rewarded decisiveness, regardless of nationality. The second angle was tactical. At Kasserine, American forces suffered not because they lacked firepower, but because they failed to concentrate it. Tanks were deployed piecemeal rather than in mass. Infantry positions were established without sufficient overlapping fields of fire. Artillery, the most powerful asset available to U.S. units, was often underutilized due to poor observation and communication. German tactics exploited these weaknesses systematically. Panzer units advanced with infantry and artillery closely integrated. When American armor appeared, German anti-tank guns were already positioned to engage them. When resistance stiffened, German forces maneuvered around it rather than attacking head-on. Speed and flexibility defined their approach. Air power, a potential American advantage, was not effectively coordinated with ground operations. Requests for air support were delayed or misdirected. When aircraft did arrive, they often lacked precise targeting information. The result was a series of missed opportunities that allowed German units to maintain momentum. The third angle was leadership. Major General Lloyd Fredendall's command style became a focal point of criticism in the aftermath of Kasserine. His headquarters, deeply buried and far from the front, symbolized a disconnect between decision-makers and battlefield reality. Orders were frequently vague, transmitted through multiple layers, and difficult to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. In contrast, German leadership at the tactical level emphasized initiative. Junior officers were expected to exploit opportunities without waiting for detailed instructions. This difference was starkly visible during the battle. While American units awaited guidance, German formations were already moving. Yet leadership failure was not limited to one individual. Kasserine exposed systemic issues within the U.S. Army. Training emphasized obedience over adaptability. Doctrine favored linear defense over maneuver. Communication structures assumed stability where none existed. These were institutional problems, not merely personal ones. Still, the battle also revealed potential. Some American units fought effectively despite the confusion. Artillery officers who established forward observation posts inflicted heavy losses on advancing German columns. Tank crews who coordinated closely with infantry managed to hold key positions longer than expected. These moments, though overshadowed by defeat, hinted at what the U.S. Army could achieve with the right adjustments. From the German perspective, Kasserine seemed to confirm long-held assumptions. German commanders viewed the Americans as technically proficient but tactically immature, well-supplied but slow to react, courageous but constrained by rigid systems. Rommel himself believed that with proper handling, his forces could continue to exploit these weaknesses. But warfare rarely allows assumptions to stand unchallenged. The shock of Kasserine reverberated through Allied headquarters. Reports poured in. Casualty figures were tallied. Equipment losses were assessed. What emerged was not denial, but recognition. The realization that survival and victory would require immediate, uncomfortable change. The Americans had been tested and found wanting, but the test had also revealed the path forward. That path would be shaped by new leadership, revised doctrine, and a determination that Kasserine Pass would never happen again.
From the German angle, Kasserine Pass appeared at first as a textbook success. Rommel's forces had achieved surprise, shattered an inexperienced enemy, and advanced deep into Allied positions. German after-action reports noted the Americans' tendency to deploy armor without infantry support, their slow reaction to breakthroughs, and their reliance on centralized command. These observations reinforced Rommel's belief that the U.S. Army, though industrially powerful, had not yet learned the realities of mobile warfare. But even within German headquarters, caution tempered confidence. Rommel was acutely aware of his constraints. Fuel shortages limited how far and how fast his panzer units could push. Allied air power, increasingly dominant, harassed supply lines and movement by day. Every mile gained had to be weighed against the risk of overextension. Kasserine had opened a door, but it was a door leading into uncertainty. The technological angle further complicated the picture. On paper, American equipment was formidable. The M4 Sherman tank was reliable, easy to maintain, and available in large numbers. American artillery was accurate and plentiful. Communications equipment, when functioning, offered advantages in coordination. The problem was not technology, it was integration. At Kasserine, American tanks advanced without adequate reconnaissance. Artillery units lacked forward observers. Infantry and armor often operated as separate entities rather than as a single system. German forces, by contrast, treated combined arms not as a theory, but as a habit. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and engineers moved together, each supporting the other's weaknesses. Yet technology cuts both ways. German units were increasingly forced to rely on worn equipment and dwindling spare parts. Replacement tanks arrived slowly, if at all. Losses that might have been acceptable earlier in the war now carried heavier consequences. The longer the campaign dragged on, the more these limitations would matter. The moral and psychological angle was perhaps the most consequential. For the Americans, Kasserine was a shock that bordered on humiliation. Newspapers at home reported a setback, not a disaster, but within the ranks the effect was profound. Officers questioned their readiness. Soldiers questioned their leaders. Confidence was shaken, but not destroyed. What emerged instead was resolve. Senior Allied commanders, including Dwight Eisenhower, refused to dismiss the defeat as inevitable. Instead, they treated it as a diagnostic moment. Weaknesses were identified with unusual candor. Command relationships were reevaluated. Training methods were scrutinized. There was no time for gradual reform. The war would not wait. For German commanders, the psychological impact was subtler. Kasserine reinforced the belief that the Americans could be handled, even defeated, with aggressive maneuver and experienced leadership. But it also planted the seed of underestimation. The assumption that American forces would remain predictable and slow to adapt was an assumption rooted in early impressions, not long-term analysis. History would challenge that assumption quickly. The American response to Kasserine was swift and uncompromising. Commanders who could not adapt were replaced. Units were reorganized. Combined arms training was intensified under real battlefield conditions. Forward command posts were established. Initiative at lower levels was encouraged rather than punished. Perhaps most importantly, discipline and clarity were imposed. Orders became shorter, expectations clearer, standards higher. The culture of the U.S. Army began to shift from theoretical preparedness to practical effectiveness. This transformation did not erase fear or eliminate mistakes, but it changed how those mistakes were addressed. From Rommel's perspective, time was running out. Allied pressure was increasing on every front. Supplies dwindled. The window for decisive action narrowed with each passing week. The assumption that American forces would remain fragile depended on time, a resource the Axis no longer possessed. The next engagement would not resemble Kasserine. When American forces met German armor again, they would do so under different leadership, with clearer doctrine and a determination forged in defeat. The pass through the Atlas Mountains had exposed American weakness, but it had also hardened American resolve. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test whether learning under fire could outpace experience earned over years of war.
The response to Kasserine Pass began almost immediately. Within days, Allied headquarters in North Africa initiated a series of changes that signaled a fundamental shift in how the U.S. Army would fight. The defeat had exposed too much to ignore. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, understood that credibility, both with British allies and within his own ranks, depended on decisive action. The first change was leadership. Major General Lloyd Fredendall was relieved of command of Second Corps. In his place came Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., a commander whose reputation for discipline, aggression, and personal presence was already well established. Patton arrived not quietly, but deliberately. His message was unmistakable. Disorder would not be tolerated, and failure would not be excused by inexperience. Patton did not arrive alone. With him came Major General Omar Bradley as his deputy, a methodical officer whose calm judgment balanced Patton's intensity. Together, they represented a new command philosophy, one that combined strict standards with practical adaptability. Command posts were moved forward. Officers were expected to understand the terrain, the enemy, and their own units firsthand. Changes extended beyond personalities. Patton enforced discipline with visible rigor. Uniform standards were tightened. Weapons maintenance was inspected personally. Units were reorganized to ensure clearer chains of command. These measures were not cosmetic. They were intended to restore confidence by imposing order in an environment that had descended into confusion. Training evolved under fire. American units began intensive combined arms drills even as the campaign continued. Infantry learned to operate alongside tanks rather than behind them. Artillery coordination improved as forward observers were pushed closer to the front. Air-ground communication procedures were refined to reduce delays and misidentification. Crucially, initiative was redefined. Junior officers were encouraged to act decisively when opportunities emerged. Waiting for perfect information was no longer acceptable. Patton and Bradley understood that German success had been built on speed and flexibility. The Americans would have to match that tempo, even if it meant taking calculated risks. The psychological effect was immediate. Morale, shaken by Kasserine, began to stabilize. Soldiers understood what was expected of them. Clear rules replaced uncertainty. Confidence returned, not because defeat had been forgotten, but because it had been confronted directly. The battlefield context, meanwhile, remained unforgiving. German forces, though constrained by supply shortages, continued to probe Allied positions. Rommel, aware that American leadership had changed, adjusted his expectations. He still believed his forces held a qualitative edge, but he no longer assumed easy success. The test came quickly. In March 1943, American and German forces collided again in southern Tunisia, near a small town named El Guitar. The terrain differed from Kasserine, more open, less confined, but the stakes were no lower. For the Americans, this was not merely another engagement. It was a chance to prove that Kasserine had been a lesson, not a verdict. At El Guitar, American defenses were prepared deliberately. Artillery was positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Anti-tank guns were sighted with clear lines of sight. Infantry units were integrated with armor rather than scattered in isolation. Air-ground communication plans were coordinated in advance, with clearer communication channels established between ground and air commanders. When German armor advanced, it encountered something unfamiliar. Instead of piecemeal resistance, it met a layered defense. Instead of confusion, it faced coordinated fire. German tanks moved forward with confidence born of experience, but this time American artillery responded with precision and volume. The battle unfolded over hours of sustained combat. German assaults were repelled, regrouped, and attempted again. Each time, American firepower forced them back. Losses mounted. Momentum slowed. The assumptions formed at Kasserine were tested against a very different reality. For the first time in North Africa, American forces held their ground against a major German armored attack. This was not yet victory, but it was transformation made visible under fire. The turning point had begun, but its meaning would only be fully understood as the battle continued. The fighting at El Guettar intensified as March 1943 progressed. German forces, including elements of the 10th Panzer Division, launched repeated assaults against American positions. Their objective was clear: break through the U.S. defensive line, disrupt Allied momentum, and restore the operational freedom that Kasserine had briefly provided. What they encountered instead was resistance shaped by hard-earned adaptation. American artillery dominated the battlefield. Forward observers, positioned closer to the front than ever before, directed concentrated barrages with speed and accuracy. When German tanks emerged from defilade, they were met by coordinated fire from artillery, tank destroyers, and anti-tank guns working in concert. The Americans no longer fought as isolated units, but as a system. Air power played its role as well. Improved coordination between ground commanders and Allied aircraft allowed for more timely strikes. German columns attempting to maneuver in daylight faced increasing harassment from the air, compounding their logistical difficulties. Movement became riskier, resupply slower. The battlefield narrowed under pressure from above. German persistence met American resolve. Rommel, observing the battle's development, recognized that conditions had changed. The Americans were no longer reacting blindly. They anticipated movement, they adjusted positions, they absorbed losses without collapsing. Each failed assault cost the Axis forces precious fuel, vehicles, and experienced crews, resources that could not be replaced. The tactical outcome at El Guettar was not a dramatic breakthrough, but it was decisive in another way. American forces held, German forces withdrew. The significance of this moment extended beyond the immediate battlefield. It demonstrated that the U.S. Army could learn faster than the enemy expected, that institutional reform, when driven by necessity and enforced with clarity, could translate into combat effectiveness in weeks rather than years. For Rommel, the implications were sobering. Shortly after El Guettar, Rommel was recalled to Germany officially for health reasons. His departure marked the end of his direct involvement in the African campaign. In his absence, Axis forces continued to resist, but the initiative increasingly belonged to the Allies. Rommel's earlier assessment that American soldiers were inexperienced and easily disorganized had been accurate at Kasserine, but it was no longer sufficient. The Americans had absorbed the shock, corrected their failures, and adapted under fire. The window in which German experience could compensate for Allied material and manpower superiority was closing rapidly. The broader campaign reflected this shift. Allied forces tightened their grip on Tunisia. German and Italian units were pushed into increasingly confined positions. Airfields fell. Supply routes were severed. Every engagement reinforced the same pattern. American units were no longer brittle. They were coordinated, disciplined, and increasingly confident. The transformation was not flawless. Mistakes continued. Losses were still taken. But the nature of those losses had changed. They were no longer the result of systemic collapse, but of the inherent brutality of modern warfare. By May 1943, the Axis position in North Africa was untenable. Surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from resupply, German and Italian forces faced the inevitable. Over 250,000 Axis troops would surrender in Tunisia, marking one of the largest mass capitulations of the war. The African campaign ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with the quiet exhaustion of an army that had reached the limits of endurance. For the Americans, the victory carried weight far beyond numbers. It validated the painful lessons of Kasserine. It proved that adaptation could outpace experience, and it signaled to allies and enemies alike that the U.S. Army was no longer a force to be tested lightly. The smoke cleared over Tunisia, but the consequences of what had happened there would shape every battlefield the Americans entered next. The surrender in Tunisia in May 1943 marked the end of the North African campaign and the beginning of a new phase in the war. More than 250,000 German and Italian troops laid down their arms, a loss that rivaled Stalingrad in scale and psychological impact. For the Axis, Africa was finished. For the Allies, it was proof that momentum had decisively shifted. For the United States Army, the victory carried a deeper significance. The campaign had begun with uncertainty and ended with confidence earned the hard way. Kasserine Pass was no longer viewed solely as a defeat, but as the crucible in which an untested army had been forced to mature under fire. The cost had been high. Thousands of American casualties, hundreds of tanks and vehicles destroyed or abandoned. But the lessons extracted from those losses reshaped how the U.S. Army fought. Reports compiled after the campaign were unusually direct. Command failures were documented without euphemism. Doctrinal weaknesses were acknowledged. Training deficiencies were cataloged. The U.S. Army did not mythologize Kasserine, it studied it. Staff officers analyzed why units broke down, how German maneuver warfare exploited rigid structures, and where American strengths, particularly artillery and logistics, had been misused. Those strengths, once properly integrated, proved decisive. American artillery had emerged from Tunisia as the backbone of battlefield dominance. Its accuracy, volume, and flexibility, when coordinated with infantry and armor, gave U.S. commanders a tool that German forces increasingly struggled to counter. Air-ground coordination, refined under pressure, became a defining feature of American operations. Leadership changes solidified these gains. Patton's tenure in Second Corps reinforced a culture of accountability and presence. Commanders were expected to be forward, informed, and decisive. Bradley's influence ensured that aggression was balanced with careful planning. This combination, discipline without rigidity, became a template for future operations. The impact extended beyond individuals. Entire divisions rotated through Tunisia, having experienced real combat against a skilled enemy. Soldiers who had fled under fire weeks earlier now understood what survival required. Non-commissioned officers emerged as critical links between orders and execution. Trust, fractured at Kasserine, was rebuilt through competence rather than rhetoric. For the German army, Tunisia was a warning. Early confidence in American weakness gave way to recognition of American adaptability. German commanders noted the speed with which U.S. forces corrected errors. The assumption that American troops would remain tactically naive proved false. While German units continued to fight effectively, they increasingly faced an opponent whose learning curve was steep and accelerating. Strategically, the loss of North Africa forced the Axis into a defensive posture across the Mediterranean. Italy became the next battleground. German resources were diverted to shore up a front that might otherwise have remained secondary. Allied shipping flowed through the Mediterranean with reduced threat. The groundwork was laid for the invasions of Sicily and mainland Italy. For American soldiers preparing for those landings, the memory of Kasserine lingered. It was spoken of quietly, without embellishment, a reminder of what happened when preparation met reality without adaptation. It reinforced a collective understanding that victory depended not on reputation or equipment alone, but on coordination, leadership, and the willingness to learn faster than the enemy. The North African campaign closed not with celebration, but with sober resolve. The war was far from over. Harder battles lay ahead. But the Americans who left Tunisia carried with them something they had lacked when they arrived: proof, earned under fire, that they could face Germany's best and endure. And that understanding would shape every decision that followed. The influence of Kasserine Pass extended far beyond the mountains of Tunisia. It reshaped the United States Army at an institutional level, affecting how it planned, trained, and fought for the remainder of the war. One of the most enduring changes was doctrinal. The U.S. Army emerged from North Africa committed to true combined arms warfare. Infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air support were no longer treated as separate tools applied in sequence, but as interconnected elements employed simultaneously. Training manuals were revised. Field exercises emphasized coordination over maneuver alone. Commanders were taught to think in terms of systems rather than units. Leadership development followed the same logic. Officers who demonstrated adaptability and presence were promoted. Those who clung to rigid control or avoided the front were sidelined. The lesson was clear. Modern war demanded commanders who understood both the map and the mud. This philosophy would shape American leadership from Sicily to Normandy and beyond. The impact was immediately visible in subsequent campaigns. During the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, American forces faced difficult terrain, aggressive German counterattacks, and complex coordination challenges. Mistakes still occurred, but systemic collapse did not. Units adjusted. Artillery and air power were brought to bear with increasing effectiveness. The patterns established after Kasserine held. In Italy, where mountainous terrain again tested coordination and endurance, American forces demonstrated a growing ability to sustain pressure over time. Lessons learned in Tunisia about logistics, terrain, and enemy tactics informed planning and execution. The army that struggled at Kasserine no longer existed in the same form. By the time of the Normandy landings in June 1944, the transformation was unmistakable. American units arriving in France were led by officers hardened by experience and doctrine shaped by failure. Combined arms operations were executed on a scale unimaginable in early 1943. Air-ground coordination reached levels of complexity and effectiveness that overwhelmed German defenses. The speed at which American forces adapted to unexpected resistance in Normandy reflected lessons first learned in North Africa. Kasserine's legacy was also psychological. American soldiers no longer feared German armor as an unstoppable force. They respected it, prepared for it. The myth of German invincibility had been dismantled, not by rhetoric, but by experience. Confidence replaced naivety. Discipline replaced improvisation born of confusion. For Rommel, who would later face American forces in Normandy, the change was evident. The army he encountered in France bore little resemblance to the one he had judged in Tunisia. It was methodical, aggressive, and supported by overwhelming firepower applied with increasing precision. The assumptions formed at Kasserine no longer applied. History often remembers victories. Less often does it remember the defeats that made them possible. Kasserine Pass was one such defeat. It did not decide the war. It did something more subtle and perhaps more important. It forced an institution to confront its weaknesses honestly under conditions where failure carried immediate consequences. The United States Army did not win in Tunisia because it was perfect. It won because it learned faster than the enemy expected, faster than the enemy could afford. That capacity for adaptation forged in the cold passes of the Atlas Mountains, became one of its defining characteristics for the remainder of the war. As the campaign faded into memory, Kasserine remained not as a symbol of failure, but as a reminder of transformation earned through necessity. The war moved on. The lessons stayed. Kasserine Pass occupies an uncomfortable place in American military memory. It was not a heroic stand. It was not a narrow victory. It was a moment when assumptions met reality and failed under pressure. Yet, history is rarely shaped by perfection. What Kasserine revealed was not weakness alone, but potential, latent, unrefined, and costly to uncover. The American soldiers who fought there did not lack courage. They lacked experience, cohesion, and leadership suited to modern war. Those deficiencies were exposed brutally in full view of an enemy who believed he had seen the limits of American capability. Rommel's judgment, formed in the smoke and confusion of February 1943, was understandable. At that moment, the Americans were inexperienced, rigid, and vulnerable to maneuver. But his assessment captured only a snapshot, not a trajectory. It measured what the U.S. Army was, not what it could become when forced to adapt. The true significance of Kasserine lies in what followed. Instead of denying failure, the American command confronted it. Instead of protecting reputations, it changed leaders. Instead of clinging to doctrine, it rewrote it. The response was not immediate victory, but disciplined transformation, quiet, methodical, and relentless. Within months, the same army that had faltered in the Atlas Mountains was executing coordinated operations across North Africa. Within a year, it was landing in France and sustaining combat on a continental scale. The distance between those moments was bridged not by time alone, but by learning, paid for in lives and steel. Kasserine teaches a broader lesson about war and institutions. Experience matters, but so does the ability to absorb failure without being defined by it. Armies that cannot learn break. Armies that learn too slowly are destroyed. The U.S. Army survived its first great test against Germany because it learned quickly, faster than its enemy expected, faster than its enemy could afford. In that sense, Kasserine Pass was not the place where American confidence collapsed. It was the place where American complacency ended. And in the long, grinding calculus of the Second World War, that change mattered far more than Rommel ever imagined.